Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Health and Wellness webinar, The Impact Herbs and Spices Have on Improving Diet Quality. I am so excited personally, but we are thrilled to have two wonderful speakers here with us today, brought to you by the Foundation for Fresh Produce. For those who don't know me, my name is Katie Calagero. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here for the Foundation for Fresh Produce, and it is my pleasure to host you for today's webinar. You may have already been aware of our Have a Plant campaign, but for those who aren't, we have programs that are committed to helping consumers live happier, healthier lives by boosting appeal for fruits and vegetables. And we do this by creating compelling content and distributing science-based, consumer-focused resources for food, nutrition, and health and wellness influencer engagement throughout our entire digital ecosystem. This includes fruitsandveggies.org and all of our fruits and veggies social media channels. So thank you for being an integral part of the Have a Plant movement. Some of the educational resources we have include consumer insights and communication tools that can help you inspire this lasting behavior change we're trying to achieve together and help you in your day-to-day lives in everything that you're doing as you're communicating and engaging with consumers. These resources and our core messages are something that you can rally around as you're working and educating consumers about the importance of having a plant every time you eat. So every time you eat, we want you to have a plant. That's the message. Simple. I just want to highlight that in the latest Have a Plant Influencer Toolkit, you'll find research tidbits, expert quotes, turnkey social media posts, as well as activation ideas that you can implement in a variety of settings, like in retail or in food service, in schools or in restaurants. And the goal is to really provide unified messaging that helps us work together to encourage consumers to eat and enjoy more fruits and vegetables every single day. So before we begin, I want everybody to take a step back, relax. I've got a couple of housekeeping notes. So at the completion of this webinar, you will be getting 1 CPU credit in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration, CPEU. This certificate will be emailed to you after the presentation. And like I said, guess what? You can sit back, relax, take it all in, because we're going to be sending you the slides and the webinar recording after the presentation along with your certificate. I'm sure you're going to have questions and a lot of ideas to share with our guests today. So we want you to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom. You could also put them in the chat, but I would like to try to stay focused in the Q&A so that I can have an organized look, and then we're going to open it up at the end for all of your questions and hopefully a fun little conversation between our speakers. So now that you're aware of how to ask questions and that we're going to be sending you this presentation and the recording and all the things, let's dig in to our learning objectives for today's webinar, which are listed here. I'm not going to read them because I want our speakers to have the full time today. So let me get right into introducing who we have with today. I'd like to introduce Dr. Christina Peterson, an associate professor from the Pennsylvania State University. My alma mater, woo, woo, we are. Christina's research is focused on evaluating the effectiveness of dietary interventions to reduce metabolic dysfunction and cardiometabolic disease risk in at-risk populations. She's going to break down our research for us today and talk about some other studies that they have on the horizon. Our second speaker, Emily Holdorf, is a registered dietitian and is also the Foundation for Fresh Produce influencer and community manager. So you probably interacted with Emily at one point or another, either at an event or online. Emily's going to translate this research into actionable and practical takeaways for you to implement in your various fields of work at the end of Christina's presentation. So without further ado, Christina, I'm going to turn it over to you to take us away. I'm excited for this journey.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. It's really great to be with you all today to talk about a topic that I really love talking about. We're going to look at how herbs and spices can be used to improve diet quality. So this first slide provides an overview of our presentation. So I'm going to start out with some statistics about diet quality in the United States, and then talk some about the role of taste in food choice and how this is an important driver of food choice and food purchasing behavior. I'm then going to highlight some key research which has demonstrated the potential for herbs and spices to improve diet quality. And I'm going to finish up by talking about taste-focused labeling and how we can use this to promote intake of fruits and vegetables. Next slide, please. So we know that diet quality at every life stage affects health and well-being. So this is a slide from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report in 2020, and it really underscores how we need to have high diet quality from infancy all the way through to older adulthood because of the substantial evidence that we have about the influence of diet quality on health, disease prevention, as well as wellness. Next slide, please. However, we know that diet quality in the United States is poor across all life stages. This figure presents adherence to the dietary guidelines for Americans. So a score is provided out of 100, with 100 being adherence to all of the dietary recommendations. And what we see here is data from NHANES, so a nationally representative database, that shows that from age 2 all the way through to older adulthood, scores are in the low 50s to the low 60s. So these are very low scores and underscore the importance of strategies to improve diet quality. Next slide. So you might be wondering, well, why is diet quality so poor? So it's for two reasons. One is underconsumption of healthful or recommended foods. And then the second reason is that we have higher intake of dietary components that should be limited. So starting first with dietary intake of healthful components. So this figure here, again, using nationally representative data, shows intake of recommended food groups, so vegetables, fruits, grains, dairy, and protein foods. And in the dark blue is intake below recommendations, and in the purple is intake at or above recommendations. So what we can take away from this figure is that vegetable intake vegetables are underconsumed by around 90% of the US population 1 year and older. We also see that fruit consumption is underconsumed by about 80% of US individuals, and whole grains are underconsumed by the vast majority of the US population. Next slide, please. The other side of this coin is that added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium are all overconsumed. So in this slide, I'm showing data again from NHANES. This is for the age group 19 to 30. However, when we look at the other age groups, we see very similar patterns here. So in orange is the percentage that's exceeding the limits, and then in blue is the proportion who is within the recommended limits. And what we see here is the vast majority of adults are exceeding recommendations for added sugars and saturated fat, and almost all are exceeding recommendations for sodium. Next slide, please. And so this really underscores why we need strategies to improve diet quality and why this is important. So then moving into the next slide, we know that taste is a key driver of food choice. And so leveraging taste could help us to improve intake of healthful foods. So here I'm showing data from the 2024 Food and Health Survey conducted by the International Food Information Council, which highlights that taste is a top purchase driver. So you see here data from 2010 all the way through to 2024, and we see throughout that time, taste has remained the top purchase driver. So it's driving more purchasing than price, healthfulness, convenience, and environmental sustainability. And there's lots of other data to suggest that taste or perception of taste is driving food choice and food selection as well. So moving into the next slide, So in 2020 to 2025, the dietary guidelines for Americans for the first time recognized the role of herbs and spices in promoting taste. So on this slide, I have the four key dietary recommendations that many of you will be familiar with. So one is to follow a healthy dietary pattern. Two is around customizing and enjoying nutrient-dense foods and beverages. Three is around focusing on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages. And then four is to limit foods and beverages that are higher in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, and to limit alcoholic beverages. So when we look specifically at guideline 2, so in the next slide, and then we drill down to incorporating cultural traditions. In the next slide, we see the messaging included around herbs and spices. So specifically, it was stated that herbs and spices can help flavor foods when reducing added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. And they can also add to the enjoyment of nutrient-dense foods and dishes and meals that reflect specific cultures. So really underscoring the role that herbs and spices can have in flavor and promoting intake of healthy food choices. So in the next slide, so what I'm going to do in this presentation is present some of the evidence that led to the inclusion of that statement in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 2020. So first, I'm going to look at some evidence that we have that herbs and spices can improve the acceptability of foods lower in saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. And then I'm going to talk about some research that's been done looking at how herbs and spices can increase the liking of under-consumed dietary components. And here I'm going to specifically focus on research related to vegetables. So for the first part of the presentation, we're going to talk about the increasing liking of foods lower in overconsumed dietary components. So next slide, please. And then next. So I'm going to start with some work that we published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics earlier this year. And so this research was actually featured on the cover of the journal. And here what we were doing was looking at how herbs and spices can be used to enhance the flavor of commonly consumed foods that have been reformulated to be lower in overconsumed dietary components. So next slide, please. So our research question here was whether we can use herbs and spices to enhance the flavor of commonly consumed foods that are lower in saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium, and if this can meaningfully lower population level intake of these overconsumed nutrients and increase diet quality, and importantly, is this acceptable to consumers? And so to achieve or to answer this question, we had three aims. So firstly, we identified top contributors to saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium in the US diet. And then we conducted recipe modification to reduce the amount of saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium in these recipes. And then we added herbs and spices to enhance the flavor. In the second part of this research, we then modeled what would happen if people who were currently consuming these foods adopted the modified version of these recipes. And so we looked at intake of saturated fat, sodium, added sugars, and then also diet quality here. And then in the final part, we wanted to evaluate consumer acceptance of these healthier recipes. So we wanted to know whether consumers like these recipes and how much they like them relative to the original recipe. So next slide, please. So this slide summarizes some of the methodology we used. So in order to identify the recipes that we modified, we used NHANES data, the most recent cycles, because we really wanted to be able to identify foods that represent common sources of sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars in the US diet. Now, this was proof of concept research. So the goal was to identify 10 recipes that we could modify one or more of overconsumed nutrients. So at least one of added sugar, saturated fat, or sodium. Some recipes we could modify all three. And so we also wanted to pick recipes where we could use herbs and spices to enhance the flavor. So the recipe lended itself to the addition of these herbs and spices, and that would be acceptable to consumers. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the 10 recipes that we selected that were common sources of saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium. And it also shows the percent difference in saturated fat, sodium, added sugars, and also energy in the modified recipe versus the original version of the recipe. And so important to note here, the goal wasn't to get saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars as low as possible. We also wanted to preserve the culinary aspects of the recipe. So we wanted to keep the texture, the appearance, the mouthfeel the same in these recipes. So we just lowered these components to an extent where we didn't affect the recipe, but we made the recipe healthier, and then we were able to add herbs and spices in to add back some of that flavor. You can see here all of the recipes had reductions in saturated fat and sodium. For added sugars, we only were meaningfully reduced added sugars in 4 of the 10 recipes because the other recipes did not include added sugars or only included a very small amount of added sugars. So the next slide, please. So this slide provides an example of one of the recipes that we modified. So one of the recipes was mac and cheese. So for each of the 10 foods that we modified, we had 3 recipes. So one was the original recipe. So this reflected the recipe from the NHANES database. If it wasn't included in the NHANES database, we worked with chefs to construct a recipe that mimicked the nutrient profile of what was included in the NHANES database. We then had a nutritionally improved recipe. So this is where we reduced added sugar, saturated fat, and or sodium. And then we had a nutritionally improved flavor enhanced version. So this is exactly the same as the nutritionally improved version, but here we've added herbs and spices to enhance the flavor. So for the example shown here, you can see that for the nutritionally improved version, we reduced some of the butter and we used unsalted instead of salted butter. And we used vegetable oil for the remainder of the fat. We used skim milk instead of reduced fat milk. We were able to substitute some of the cheese for reduced sodium and reduced fat cheese. And we were also able to reduce some of the butter and use an unsalted version for the topping here. For the flavor enhanced version, you can see the spices that we added here. So this was onion and garlic powder, as well as mustard seed, paprika, and cayenne. So that gives you an indication of what kinds of spices were included here. The aim was to include commonly consumed spices. If you're interested in the other 9 recipes, you can access those using the link at the bottom when you receive these slides. Next slide, please. So what we found here is when we conducted some modeling to look at what would happen if people who were currently consuming one or more of these 10 recipes replaced the current version that they were consuming with one of the nutritionally improved versions. So because we were modeling, we didn't want to assume 100% adoption. So what we did is we modeled out 25 through to 100% adoption. So that's what you see on the x-axis of these slides. And so for saturated fat and sodium, with 25 to 100% of current consumers adopting the modified recipes, we would see a reduction in daily intake of saturated fat and sodium of 3 to 11%. So this is quite a substantial reduction, especially considering we're only looking at 10 recipes here. We saw smaller reductions in added sugars, and this was just because only 4 of the 10 recipes included added sugars. So then moving then into the diet quality findings, which are on the next slide, we see here that with 25 to 100% adoption of the modified recipes, we could improve adherence to the dietary guidelines for Americans as assessed by the Healthy Eating Index 2020 by between 1 and 3.5 points. And so when you look at this as a percentage, this is a 2 to 7% increase. So this is quite a substantial increase, remembering the data I presented at the beginning showing that diet quality is the scores are in the low 50s through to the low 60s in the adult population. So this would be a meaningful increase. And again, it's only 10 recipes. This score involves 13 different components, which are depicted in this radar plot here. And we see the improvements were from changes in the fatty acid score, sodium, added sugars, and saturated fat, which is expected based on the modifications that we made. So then next slide, please. So then for the third component, we conducted sensory evaluations. So these were conducted at the Penn State Sensory Evaluation Center. And so what we did is we enrolled individuals to participate in blind taste testing, and they were given the 3 versions of each of the modified foods, and they were not told which was which. And so they were asked to rate their liking of each version of the recipe, and we did this for all 10 foods. And so what we found here is that the ratings for 7 of the 10 reformulated foods with herbs and spices were rated as either superior or at parity with the original foods. So suggesting that this approach is acceptable to consumers. So in the figures shown here, the original version of the recipe is shown in orange in the middle. We have the nutritionally improved version in green, and then the purple is the flavor enhanced nutritionally improved version. So for 2 of our recipes, which was the chicken and cream sauce and the brownie, actually the version with herbs and spices was preferred compared to the original version. For the chili, we didn't see any differences between the original version and the flavor enhanced version, suggesting that it was liked similarly. For the meatloaf and the apple pie, we saw that the nutritionally improved version was liked less than the original version, but with the flavor enhanced nutritionally improved version, we didn't see any difference compared to the original version of the recipe. So this shows that the addition of the herbs and spices was able to improve the flavor to an extent that it was rated similarly to the original version of the recipe. We didn't see any differences between the 3 recipe versions for the pasta with meat sauce or the taco meat, so suggesting these were liked similarly. For cheese pizza, mac and cheese, and then the chicken pot pie, we actually saw the nutritionally improved versions were liked less than the original versions. So here the addition of herbs and spices wasn't able to account for those reductions in saturated fat and added sugars. And we speculate this is primarily driven by the reductions in cheese or creaminess in these recipes. So suggesting that herbs and spices were not able to overcome some of those issues. And here there were some differences in mouthfeel with these recipes. So suggesting this approach may not lend itself for these kinds of recipes. So the next slide, please. And so in summary, this study provides evidence that herbs and spices do have the potential to improve the acceptability of foods lower in saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars, and also to improve diet quality. So then moving into whether herbs and spices can help increase intake of vegetables, moving to the next slide. So I'm going to present 3 different studies that were done in cafeteria settings. So the first study was done in an urban high school cafeteria. So this school was located in Baltimore, and the students were economically underserved and predominantly African American. And so what they did here is that they
It seems like we have a technical difficulty, so I think Christina has frozen for a second. Bear with us here. It looks like she had hopped off and she's probably gonna hop back on. Thank you for your patience here for a minute. These things always happen in the live event, huh? This is a good time to pause as she's shifting into the next section. So if anybody has any questions or thoughts or comments for discussion, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And it looks like we're back. Are you back?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what happened with the internet.
That's okay.
Okay.
We lost you at the top of this was a high school in Baltimore. And then after that, you kind of froze. So
Okay.
we're good. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, so yeah, this study was done in an urban high school in Baltimore. And so this school consists of primarily economically underserved and African American students. And so in this research, what they did is they had two different phases. So in the first phase, they had a stakeholder analysis, and they also conducted some sensory evaluations to see what kinds of recipes, spice pairings would be acceptable to these students. And then in the second phase, what they did is, as part of the vegetable offering for the National School Lunch Program, they offered either unseasoned vegetables or vegetables seasoned with herbs and spices. And then they looked at consumption and plate waste. And so what they showed here, which is shown in the figure, is that intake of the seasoned vegetables increased compared to the unseasoned vegetables. So the seasoned vegetables here are shown in the green and the unseasoned is shown in blue. So you can see for the different vegetable offerings, including herbs and spices, actually increased intake quite substantially. Then moving into the next slide, a similar study was conducted in rural high and middle school students. So this work was done in Pennsylvania. And what they observed here is similar findings where compared to plain or unseasoned vegetables offered as part of the National School Lunch Program, seasoned vegetables were liked more. So you can see across these different vegetable likings, most, but not all vegetables were liked more. And, you know, some of this is around the flavor profile. So you can see for the carrots, which are at the right side of the slide here, the ratings depended on the seasonings added. So you can see here the cinnamon seasoned carrots were preferred compared to the ginger garlic carrots. So underscoring the importance of matching the flavor profile or selecting seasonings that are going to be acceptable to the target audience, which in this case was students. So then moving into the next slide, this slide presents data from two different studies that were this time conducted in public cafeterias that were in university settings. So both of these studies were done in the Urbana, Illinois area. And so in the first study, where the data is shown on the left side of the slide, what they did here is for any person coming to the cafeteria over a 3-week period, that ordered a main entree, they offered them a vegetable at no cost. And so they were offered either seasoned vegetables, so with the addition of herbs and spices, or unseasoned vegetables. And so what they showed here is that when they offered the seasoned version, a greater number of people selected that option compared to the unseasoned version, and then also compared to people that declined to get a vegetable altogether. And they observed this across 3 different vegetable offerings. In the second study, which was done by the same group in the same area, this time they offered the seasoned vegetable at a low cost of $1 versus an unseasoned vegetable. And so what they showed here is that even when they charged $1, people were still a greater number of vegetable servings were purchased when they were seasoned. And you see that across all the different vegetable offerings. So suggesting that people prefer seasoned versions, but they also are willing to pay for that. So then moving into the next slide. So this research suggests that, seasoning vegetables with herbs and spices in cafeteria settings, whether that be in schools or in universities, may be a way to increase intake of vegetables. So then moving into the next part of the presentation, I want to present some relatively recent research that's coming out showing the importance of labeling and how this can influence diner selection and also intake of vegetables. So we know that taste-focused labels elevate diners' expectations of a positive taste experience because they convey the specific flavors a diner should expect in the dish, and they also convey a positive experience. So examples of a taste-focused label would be zesty ginger, turmeric, sweet potatoes, or sizzling Cajun spice-inspired cabbage, or dynamite chili and tangy seasoned beets. And so all of these convey what a consumer should expect in terms of the flavor profile of these vegetables. For those that are interested in more information about developing taste-focused labeling, the Edgy Veggie Toolkit, which I've included a link to the left side of this slide, provides tools and tips and strategies for how to develop taste-focused labeling for foods that are being offered to diners or in public spaces. Moving then to the next slide. So the reason why taste focus labeling may be understood through the unhealthy equals tasty intuition. So this theory posits that the less healthy an item is portrayed to be, the better the inferred taste, the more it's enjoyed during actual consumption, and the greater the preference for that food is. And so then the inverse of this is true too. So if we present a food as healthy, it's inferred to taste worse, it's enjoyed less during consumption, and there's lower preference for that food. So moving to the next slide, this can help us to understand why taste-focused labeling may be working. And so in the Edgy Veggie Toolkit, they describe taste-focused labeling in 4 ways. So it could be an indulgent label, conveys excitement or a unique ingredient or preparation method. It may be traditional or may be location-based. So looking at indulgent labeling, this could convey that the dish is particularly satisfying. So terms like mouth-watering could be used. For exciting, this might words that convey this might be inspired. For traditional, this would where words like home style or countryside might be used. And then location-based terms could be used as well. So things like New Orleans or Shanghai conveys those kinds of taste profiles. Moving to the next slide. So I want to present some evidence or some research that's been done looking at the effect of different kinds of labels on selection of vegetables and then also the ratings of those vegetables. So in this first study, they looked at the effect of traditional health-focused labeling compared to taste-focused labeling on adult selection and enjoyment of healthy foods. And the next slide, please. And so what they did in this study is that they surveyed diners. So they had over 200 diners here selecting salads and vegetable wraps at a conference lunch buffet in Northern California. So the salad, they labeled either with a health-focused label, so light and healthy salad, or with a taste-focused label, so Indulgent Creations Deluxe Salad. They did the same for the vegetable wrap. So the health-focused label was Healthy Choice Vegetable Wrap, and then the taste-focused label was Mouth-watering Grilled Vegetable Wrap. And important to note here, the salads were exactly the same and the wraps were exactly the same, regardless of the label that was put on the dish. And so what they found is when they put a taste focused label on the salad and the vegetable wrap, there was an increase in the percentage of diners choosing the salad and the wraps. And you can see for the vegetable wrap, the increase was 84%. So a huge increase in diners who wanted to choose the wrap. Then moving to the next slide. So in the next study, these authors built on that evidence I just presented, and this time they wanted to look at different kinds of healthy labels. So whether you use a healthy restrictive label, so talking about the components that are being restricted, versus a healthy positive label, which is talking about the health promoting aspects of a different food. And so this study was done in a large university cafeteria setting, again in California, that was serving more than 600 meals per day. So again, they had a lot of dining decisions here. So they had 4 conditions. They had the indulgent labeling, which is taste-focused labeling. They had a basic label that just conveyed what the vegetable was that was being served. They had their healthy restrictive. So an example would be lighter choice beets with no added sugar. And then they had their healthy positive label, which is high antioxidant beets, for example. Moving to the next slide. And so what they saw here is when they labeled the vegetables with an indulgent description or a taste-focused label, they saw a greater number of diners choosing that vegetable offering compared to a basic label and also the healthy restrictive and the healthy positive. So then moving to the next slide. And so then in the final study I'm going to present, this one actually looked at intake as well. So again, they tracked a huge amount of dining decisions. So they had 185 days that they conducted this study. They tracked 140,000 dining decisions across 71 vegetable-based dishes. So they labeled the vegetables again with a taste-focused label or health-focused or a basic name. So as an example, for the turnips, you can see it was labeled as turnips, healthy choice turnips, or herb and honey turnips. And again, all of the offerings were exactly the same. It was just the labels that were different. So moving to the next slide. What they found here is that vegetable selection was increased with the taste focus label compared to both the healthy label and also the basic label. And then what they also demonstrated is that consumption was greater. So with the taste focus label, they saw that 39% more of the vegetables consumed compared to that healthy label. So suggesting that it increases both selection and then also consumption. Moving to the next slide, these authors also did some additional analyses to look at what was mediating the effect that they saw. So why did the taste focus label result in greater vegetable selection? And what these analyses showed is that the effect was strongly mediated by expectations of a positive taste experience. They saw some influence of surprise or curiosity, but a much stronger effect of the positive taste experience expectation. So moving to the next slide. So what this demonstrates is that taste-focused labels are most effective when they provide expectations of specific flavors and also a positive experience. So then moving to the next slide. So in summary, I've presented evidence today that shows that herbs and spices have the potential to improve the acceptability of foods that are lower in saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. I've also presented some evidence from school and university cafeteria settings demonstrating that seasoning vegetables with herbs and spices may promote increased intake of vegetables. And then how we can highlight herbs and spices through taste-focused labeling, and this may actually promote selection of vegetables and then also intake of the vegetables. So then moving into the next slide, and I'll hand back over to Emily.
Thank you, Christina. All right. So That was really great information. I think there was a lot of fascinating research that Christina was able to walk us through today. So I'm going to jump in these next few slides. We're going to chat through different practical applications based on your industry. So we'll talk about the retail setting, the food service setting, and then some digital and social media settings here. So first up with retail, I think that herbs and spices can really be a pantry play here. So we'll talk through how you can inspire consumers to make the herbs and spices a part of your shopper's regular shopping list. So some merchandising strategies to think about. We know the typical cross aisle promotion that we've seen throughout different retailers, or you've done yourself in your own retailer. Um, but I think taking it a little bit further and putting a little bit of different twist on it in this application is what I'm going to talk through here. So we've seen, the fresh herbs over there on the right-hand side of the screen living in proximity to some of the produce. They're in that same produce case because of the storage application there. But how can we bring some of those more dried herbs and spices into the produce section? So maybe that is literally physically taking some like starter packs of herbs and spices and positioning them near some of the produce items that would pair well together. I think there's also an opportunity for fresh cut here. So can we package some of the fresh cut fruits and veggies with some fresh herbs and spices in the same container that complement each other? So just putting that little different spin on the cross merchandising piece there. In the e-commerce setting, I think you could do the same cross aisle promotion in a virtual sense. You could also do some sales promotions, offering a discount, or maybe bundling some options together. There's also great opportunity for recipe cards, whether it's physically in the aisle in the store or same thing in the e-commerce setting on your store's app. Then the other thought that I want us all to consider here is picking a staple flavor profile. So a lot of times these herbs and spices are not a heavily repeated purchase item. We might buy, especially if it's a dried herb or spice, we might buy that every few months or something in that type of a cadence. So how can we get consumers to think about the herbs and spice aisle a little more frequently? I think we can put this concept of building a staple flavor profile into play here. So maybe it's providing different idea starters, whether it's handout or digitally based, of here's, these 3 to 5 herbs and spices that pair really well together and also pair really well with this short list of produce items. So just kind of giving the consumer that information and arming them with that to be able to pick those staple flavor profiles based on their own preferences and what they're kind of craving in those moments. And then another piece I want to touch on here in the retail setting is this update to WIC. So in April 2024, the USDA announced the updated food packages for the WIC program. And as part of that, participants can use their cash value benefit, which is what allows them to purchase fruits and vegetables. They can use that CVB for fresh herbs for the first time ever. So fresh herbs that are cut at the root or with the root intact are eligible for purchase with the CVB. Now, state agencies have about 2 years to implement this change, but they have been encouraged to move as quickly as possible with these changes. And according to the International Fresh Produce Association's PLU database that we have, there are 53 herbs available for purchase. So as you can see, there are lots of opportunities and varieties for WIC participants to purchase some of these fresh herbs now with this update. So that's very exciting. We will share the WIC policy memo that this came from in any follow-up material. So if you're interested in that, you can read a little bit more on that piece. So transitioning into applications in a food service setting. So there is a great opportunity here for educating staff on menu planning and usage when it comes to herbs and spices. I think specifically in the fresh herb piece, we could hold in-service trainings for staff on best practices for both storing those fresh herbs and how to utilize those herbs across the menu for the week. Because I think a lot of times the common barrier with specifically fresh herbs and spices is that food waste piece. So making sure that we have staff that are trained on how to best store these herbs and showcasing how to use these across the menu for several days or several meal occasions. And that way we can get the most out of that product there. Then also highlighting menu labeling. So as Christina spoke about that taste-focused labeling piece, I think that there were a lot of revelations there in the chat and just chatter about how, there's other menu items that we do focus on the taste piece or the seasoning piece or maybe some sauces and things like that. But a lot of times the produce aspect gets a little bit neglected with that taste focus. So I think a lot of times we tend to hone in on that health and wellness aspect of the produce. But as we can see, putting that emphasis on the taste piece is very enticing. And so these screenshots here are just a few examples of, this was taken from a university food service menu. So you can see both in titles and in some of the descriptions, there is some taste focused labeling going on a little bit with mentioning of herbs or certain flavors and things like that. I think there still is definitely room for more of that to go on. But this is a great first step, and I just wanted to highlight that there still is room, as you can see on this menu specifically. There's still an opportunity to call out some of these menu items based on health and wellness. So that AG is avoiding gluten, vegan options are highlighted here as well. But the two can kind of coincide. So that way we're kind of hitting all aspects of what people are looking for. If folks are looking for the health-oriented labels, they can see that easily, but also it does sound like a nice, appealing side or main entree that they might want to choose. And then coming into talking about the digital and social media realm, so recipe labeling and tagging, it kind of on a similar sense of what we just talked about with menu labeling. If you have a website or blog and you are creating recipes or posting recipes on that site, really emphasizing putting those taste-focused descriptors in recipe titles. If you have a tagging feature on your website to kind of categorize the recipes or blog posts that you have, I encourage you to consider putting some of those taste-focused labels as a tag. Not only is this going to help in terms of boosting the appeal for those recipes and things like that, but it is also going to help with the search engine optimization piece of it. So if people are searching for something specific taste-wise or flavor profile-wise, if you're including that in the title of the recipe, in the description of the recipe, that's only going to benefit you in coming up in the search there. Then this note here about keeping it short with the 5 to 10 ingredients or steps. So we recently did a survey conducted with our website visitors of fruitsandveggies.org, and people indicated that they wanted recipes that were easy and good for people with busy lifestyles. So when asked more details about that to define what that meant, they had their top three indicators were that they wanted minimal equipment and cleanup. So things like one sheet pan meals or like one pot meals. They wanted recipes that required only 20 to 30 minutes of active prep / cook time. And then they wanted between 5 to 10 ingredients / steps. So we all know that we're busy and have a lot going on, and no one wants to spend a ton of time going through a really extensive recipe if they're just trying to get something on the table on a weeknight. So I think keeping those things in mind is key when creating those recipes, and balancing that out alongside wanting to highlight a lot of these herbs and spices in the recipe dishes. Then we'll move on to experimentation. So this is a little bit more with just introducing people in your household to new to them herbs and spices or flavors. So you could put, this might be a fun activity. Maybe if you have a little more time on your hands, to put out some like cinnamon or nutmeg with sliced apples or peaches or pears. Or maybe you can put out some fresh chopped basil or cilantro with some cucumbers or tomatoes. And if you have kids, or even you're just wanting to have a fun little experience at home, you can kind of have these mix and match taste test experimentations and see what people are gravitating towards, and really introducing them to some new flavors. So it's a nice way to introduce the herbs and spices, maybe using a produce item that people are already familiar with and they're already accepting. The other hack that I have to share here is something that I like to do a lot of times, is getting creative with dips. So we don't have to make, a whole herb and spice homemade related dip from scratch, but we can use these herbs and spices to take those store-bought dips up a little notch. So if people in your household are already liking ranch, can you add a little bit of smoked paprika? Or if you want a spicy ranch, you could do cayenne powder. So things like that. Or maybe you're adding some fresh herbs to a store-bought hummus to kind of just bring out some better flavor and freshness there. So there's some opportunity there as well. And that brings me into just chatting about this example here that's on the screen of pairing these flavors together and really creating some resources that people are going to use, save, and I think really treasure, because this is a really great resource. So this I snagged from social media, but this is a great example of a produce pairing guide. People are always searching for those produce pairings, what's in season during certain times of year. When I'm monitoring like search terms, that's a term that comes up over and over again. So this post here was created to serve kind of as both a produce pairing guide, but then also she called out different herbs and spices that pair well with these produce items. So this is literally exactly what we've been talking about this whole past almost hour. And I thought this was a really nice resource. It's something that people are definitely going to save. It's something that you can riff off of if you, if you're an apple producer and maybe you have different varieties of apples, you could create a resource that lists out those different varieties with different spice pairings and things like that. So the possibilities with this type of a resource are really endless, but I thought this was a great example to highlight. So just wrapping this all up together, coming back to guideline number 2 from the dietary guidelines, like Christina mentioned, that's where the herbs and spices are showing up. And it's important to continue to encourage consumers to customize and enjoy their food and beverage choices that reflect their own personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budgetary considerations. And that's really where herbs and spices come into play.
Amazing. Wow. Okay. So much chatter, ideas are going off in the chat and in the Q&A. I love this one. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to try to get to as many as we can, but I love this one. Do herbs and spices offer any other value to the meal, like micronutrients or other um, health benefits other than taste? And I know that there's an answer, but I'll direct that to you, Dr. Peterson.
Yeah, so we've actually done some work looking at the health benefits, and we do see small benefits of herbs and spices in culinary doses. I'm talking about the amounts you would be adding to recipes, not taking like a curcumin supplement, something of that nature. So we do see small benefits in one of our studies. We saw some small reductions in blood pressure as well as blood lipids. There's some emerging evidence that the phenolic compounds in herbs and spices may be accessible to the bacteria in the gut. So more research is needed in that space to understand the health impacts of that. So yeah, the answer is you will get some health benefits from consuming the herbs and spices in addition to the great flavor.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thoughts on using dried versus fresh herbs?
There hasn't really been research comparing the two. I think it's more around what works for you. Having dry in the pantry is convenient, right? Because, it's just there. Usually a jar lasts a period of time, so you don't have to worry about buying fresh herbs. When you buy fresh herbs, obviously you have to use them quickly before they go bad. So, I think whichever kind of suits your lifestyle, the way you're cooking, the recipe that you want to incorporate it into.
Yeah, makes sense. Different uses for different things. I'm going to combo two questions I'm seeing. What seasonings were used in the school meal program recipes? And then on the other side of that, were the unseasoned vegetables salted? So
Yeah.
curious how salting versus adding herbs affected the acceptance differently.
Yeah, so great question. So in terms of the vegetable offerings, so they all met the criteria for the National School Lunch Program. So there are salt limits there, but both the unseasoned and the seasoned versions had the same amount of salt. So they put a small amount of salt on the unseasoned vegetables, and then to the seasoned version, they had the same amount of salt, and then they added the herbs and spices on top. So yeah, salt wasn't acting as a confounding factor there. And actually some research shows that when you incorporate herbs and spices, you're actually able to reduce the amount of sodium in the dish without people noticing kind of that lack of sodium. So it is a good strategy to reduce sodium too, but that wasn't done in these school lunch studies. And then in terms of what spices and herbs they added to the school lunch meals, so all of the recipes were developed by chefs. And so what they typically did is they used onion and garlic powder as the base, and then they layered flavors onto that. So that's also a good tip for at home. Onion and garlic powder serve as a good base, and then you can layer on flavors that you like. So, adding things like parsley, black pepper, dill weed, that can give kind of a herby seasoning. In some cases, they layered on ginger to give, that kind of profile. In some cases, they wanted a sweeter profile, so they would just use, plain cinnamon. So they did a range of different things. And I think here, something that was learned from those school studies is that the flavor profile has to be acceptable to the students. And depending on where you are, students are going to have different exposures to different taste profiles. So, in the study done in central rural Pennsylvania, the taste preferences were really different from the students in the Baltimore area. So some of the recipes that those students in the Baltimore area really enjoyed, they weren't rated as highly in the Pennsylvania study. So I think just being aware of the preferences and coming up with flavor profiles that suit your target audience.
That's a great idea. And somebody in the chat had an idea to actually taste test a variety of profiles to see what her population prefers, which is that's a great idea and exactly how we want people to start thinking about this. So I'm going to do one more. Any thoughts on introducing herbs and spices to babies or toddlers?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know, for babies that are breastfed, if the mother is consuming herbs and spices, they are going to get some flavor exposure through the breast milk. So in kids that are breastfed, they may actually maybe take better to herbs and spices. For kids that are formula fed, it may take longer for them to kind of accept those foods. But you know, the same principles apply to when you're introducing food to babies. You know, just repeated exposure to try to get them to accept those flavor profiles. But again, you know, the same principles can apply with using herbs and spices instead of adding sugar or salt to baby foods. So, you know, using a little bit of cinnamon in an apple puree, for example, rather than adding sugar to sweeten it up a little bit. That'll be a great approach to get some exposure to the baby.
Great. Good, good. Well, we are just about out of time. There are some more questions, but I'm afraid we might have to follow up with some more information after the webinar. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, Dr. Peterson and Emily, for these amazing insights. I'm just going to wrap us up really quickly. Again, all of our resources, including our webinars, are available for you at fruitsandveggies.org. A reminder that it is still September and it's National Fruits and Veggies Month for about one more week. Please help us celebrate and elevate fruit and vegetable consumption to a national priority as we bring in and head into what we call our most flavorful, fun time of year is all the flavors of fall, falling in love with herbs and spices for the fall. So that toolkit's available as well as all of these other resources here at fruitsandveggies.org. So that concludes our webinar for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Have a happy, healthy week. And I hope you find many occasions to have a plant. Thank you very much. Have a great day.